If you're a dog owner, you've definitely been there. You're scrolling online, you're trying to find some good training advice, and bam, you are hit with this absolute fire hose of conflicting opinions. One person says you have to be the alpha, be firm, but then the next person says it's all about positive reinforcement. So what's the deal? Does the training method you pick actually matter? Well, let's find out.
Okay, so picture this. You've just brought home an adorable new dog. You've got the leash, the bowls, you've picked out the perfect name. The next big thing is training, but the second you start looking for advice, you run straight into a wall of confusion.
On one side, you've got this old-school wisdom, right? The alpha theory. It's all about correcting bad behavior, using a firm hand, and showing your dog who's boss. But then, on the other side, you have this new-school science that says, no, you should be a partner. Reward the good choices. Use a kind hand. It is a total head-scratcher, and it leaves you wondering, what is actually best for my dog?
Instead of just relying on tradition or maybe some TV personality, what if we could find a real, objective answer? Well, a group of scientists decided to do exactly that. They put these different training methods to the test, and you know what? The results might really surprise you. So, let's follow the evidence.
So, here's what happened. Researchers in Portugal, they designed this really thorough study. It was published in the journal PLOS One, specifically to measure the real-world effects of different training methods on our companion dogs.
Now, here's the really clever part. The researchers didn't just take the training school's word for what they did. No, they actually videotaped the sessions and objectively counted how many times aversive techniques like leash pops or yelling were used. This let them create 3 really distinct groups. One that used a lot of aversives, one that used a mix, and a group that used absolutely 0.
The study was designed in 2 really smart phases. First, they looked at the dog's welfare and stress levels during the actual training classes. Then, for phase 2, they wanted to see if the training method had a lasting impact on the dog's general mood, even when they were totally away from class.
So, what did they find in that first phase? Let's take a look at what was happening to these dogs right there in the moment during the training sessions themselves.
The researchers were measuring welfare in 2 key ways. First, they were looking for those classic subtle signs of stress in dogs. You know, the lip licking, the yawning when they're not even tired, lifting a paw, body shaking. And second, they took saliva samples to measure cortisol, which you probably heard of. It's the famous stress hormone.
And wow, the results were striking. The data was just crystal clear. Dogs in both the aversive and the mixed groups showed way more stress-related behaviors during training than the dogs in the reward-based group. It wasn't even close.
And here's the kicker. The biology confirmed the behavior. The saliva samples showed that the dogs from the group using the most aversive techniques had way higher levels of cortisol after training. So they weren't just acting stressed, their bodies were physiologically stressed.
Okay, but you might be wondering, does that stress just kind of disappear once class is over? Or does the training method have a deeper, more lasting effect on a dog's general outlook on life? This is where the study's second phase gets really fascinating.
To figure out a dog's underlying emotional state, the scientists used this really cool tool called a cognitive bias test. It's basically a way to find out if a dog sees the world as a bowl half full or a bowl half empty. In other words, they were testing for optimism versus pessimism. So here's how it worked. The dogs were taught that a bowl in one spot always had a yummy treat, and a bowl in another spot was always empty. Simple enough. Then the researchers placed the bowl in a totally new, ambiguous spot, right in the middle. So the question is, how fast will the dog run to it? See, an optimistic dog is going to sprint over hoping for a treat. But a pessimistic dog? They'll hesitate, expecting disappointment.
And once again, the results were just so clear. Dogs from the group trained with the most aversive methods were significantly slower to approach that mystery bowl. In other words, they were more pessimistic. It seems like their training experiences had literally shaped their overall emotional state, even outside of the classroom.
And it's really worth pointing out, this wasn't some flimsy study. It went through an intense peer review process. That means other top scientists challenged the researchers, making sure that other factors like the dog's breed or age weren't messing with the results. That whole rigorous process just makes the conclusions even stronger, even more reliable.
Okay, so this is just one study, right? How does it fit into the bigger picture of dog training? Let's zoom out for a second and see how this evidence lines up with what modern professional trainers are talking about. First, let's talk about that whole alpha dog theory. I mean, it is everywhere, but it's based on totally outdated wolf research. In fact, the very scientist who first made the term alpha famous, Dr. L. David Meek, has spent years explaining that his original theory was wrong. Real wolf packs, as it turns out, are family units, led by the parents, not by some aggressive bully.
So, the guiding principle for today's ethical trainers is something called LIMA. It stands for Least Intrusive, Minimally Aversive. And what that means is, it's a professional standard that says trainers should always start with the kindest and most effective methods possible. They shouldn't just jump to harsh techniques when they're not even necessary.
And just so we're clear, this isn't some niche opinion from a small group of people. This is the consensus among the world's leading professional, veterinarian, and animal behavior organizations. The experts all agree, modern dog training should be built on a foundation of science and ethics, not on intimidation.
So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? Why does this whole scientific deep dive matter for you and for that dog that might be sitting at your feet right now?
It really all boils down to this. The evidence shows a really clear link between aversive-based training methods and poor welfare. We're talking about increased stress in the short term and in the long term, creating a more pessimistic dog. On the flip side, reward-based methods just weren't linked to any of these negative outcomes. Ultimately, what the science is telling us is that training is about so much more than just teaching a dog to sit or stay. The methods we choose are actively shaping our dog's entire emotional experience of the world. So the real question isn't just about what works, it's about what kind of world do we want to create for our dogs, and what kind of relationship do we truly want to build with them.